Perhaps it's part of what Maiden Growth is about. And perhaps there is something about language and the use of the term socially engaged practice in itself as not being particularly appropriate.
Need time to build relationships, to build this trust. One of the big things that came out was, for me, was about what is the point of such projects? Are they to make us feel better?
In that kind of Claire Bishop dynamic, Claire Bishop being, art writer, art critic, writing very forthrightly about socially engaged practice and saying it ends up in art which is not very good.
One of the things that struck me was that they are all words that one might either say are quite difficult to reify or concretise, or they're words about process, or kind of related to process. And I think it's sort of interesting that the architects group has been left in front of us, because one of the things about socially engaged practice, if we're going to critique the term, is context is all for me. So one might pose the rhetorical question, socially engaged practice in the Dutch pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So who's the audience for that? A project which is about asylum seekers and refugees arriving in the Netherlands and being developed into a kind of project that talks about a negative and critically aware project about creating a relational aesthetic is important, but the people who are hearing it are the people who've either been invited to an opening or have paid €15 that day, as well as getting to Venice, to get in. So there's something really interesting about how the reification of socially engaged practice generates this question about context and audience. And if you're trying to sort of say, so, okay, what has been maintained in this project from the original idea? Is it to do with these words like trust, relationships, use, a kind of sense of ethos? That sort of vaguely sounded like applause for a moment. Is it something about ethos, about process, or is it about place in a very specific sense? You go to it. Here's what you do when you go to it. Pick up the map, find these shows. Find half of them are shut. Find 2 or 3 of them are in the wrong place. And how does reification and concretising an ethos then result into sort of new process things that you have to take on board? And I say this because I'm conscious that this is the 6th Maiden Road, and that one of the things that one would say about the way it's developed, 2 things. One is something about scale, and another is something about boundaries. And it's interesting how many of these words, I think some of the challenges for Maiden Road inevitably come from its success. And how many of these words may be modified by scale and by establishing boundaries, whether they're physical boundaries, geographic boundaries, numerical boundaries, and as it were, who decides. So there's something about power and so on that's going on in the kind of the way that these words, in whatever project you're talking about. I use the illustration of one kind of project, the Dutch show in Venice 4 years ago. But you may apply it to other examples of socially engaged practice. Liverpool Biennale. People expressing a sense of disappointment this year in it and partly because they feel it's just become too big. What happens to socially engaged projects when that happens? And how do we ask our questions about our own successes and our own... so I'm sort of saying that because it struck me that we need to be talking about these words, trust, relationship, risk, etc., all of which I think are incredibly positively expressed in the context of Made in Roath. And I think Made in Roath is hugely about trust. It's evidently about building relationships. There are very, very wonderfully illustrative examples of the relationship between creativity, risk and value. And so those different coloured words are coming in to pose the question about sort of taking a view of where we are and what may come out of the discussion.
So, can I ask those of you that made in Roath happen, what was the purpose of it? Is that purpose still relevant?
I don't think it was as clear. I don't think that, unfortunately, we had some great big ambition. I think it came out of time, and like a lot of things, it grew because we love doing it.
One of the things that used to be said was that one of the things you nurture is a kind of sense of ownership, which means that people forget what the original idea was, because your process has led you to think of something which actually has turned out to be owned in such a way that the original idea kind of falls off. So in Cornwall, where I used to live, one example that was given was Maisie Day and the Glenallan Festival, which, if you ask the people of Penzance today, is a kind of medieval come early modern festival that's been happening in Penzance since time immemorial, and this and that happens, and you know, blah blah blah. So nobody remembers that it was a Knee-High Theatre Street performance project, which involved a few people, and Knee-High kind of delivered for a while, and then eventually somebody kind of took over. So I think one model is how does one kind of project evolve into something else, so that the people who originally nurtured the first model either continue to stay with it or step back in order for something else to evolve, and maybe they start doing something else alongside, so that there's a sort of a rhizomatic process of one project actually generating quite another project in such a way that we don't even really remember how it originally started.
But funny enough, my daughter got up the other morning and said, "If you die, Mum, I'm not going to take it on myself."
How old is she?
She's 13. She says, "I'm not going to be doing it, you know that."
I see how knackered you are.
I don't see any reason I should take it on board.
Another way is to become very, very governance driven. And so, you know, we can all probably think of examples where, after a period of time, successful projects develop a governance framework for 2 or 3 reasons. One, for the purposes of being funded. So a funder says, well, where's your bank account? Who are your directors? Who's the treasurer? What's your charitable number? Secondly, for reasons of legacy, you know, so that they say on arts management courses, the successful new organisation is one that has evolved in such a way that the figurehead person or persons don't need to be there for the organisation to continue. I was having a conversation about Yorkshire Sculpture Park in that context, that, you know, Peter Murray, who started it, a few friends of his putting sculpture up and having residencies round the back of the college where he taught, has ensured that over a period of 35 years, you maybe need to tell your daughter it's that kind of time scale, over 35 years, has now got to a place where Peter Murray doesn't have to be the director of Yorkshire Sculpture Park. He still is, so it becomes a kind of personal decision for him when does he retire or whatever. So
Yeah.
so that's the opposite kind of version to the sort of, as I say, sort of 80s in my head origin thing of, well, let's let everybody do it, leave them the model, and we'll go and do something else.
And I would like to ask again then, what is the model? Is the model that it's artist-led as opposed to community-led? One thing that someone said this morning was, we're artists are the community too, you know.
That's, you just answered it really. The artists are the community. We're artists. We take the lead from people's ideas. We, you know, how many things have just come up because somebody's had a brilliant idea, and we just thought that's a corker. We can't lose that, and we make it happen.